Good morning. My name is Andres, and this is Monday, July 14th, 2025. This is episode 2 officially of the Journey Onward, and I am basically creating a very unstructured personal diary, video vlog, just covering issues or thoughts, things that I've been thinking of in my life journey. There were a few things that I wanted to talk about this morning. By the way, it's 7:10. So for those of you who have watched episode 1, you're aware of my current situation, which is essentially that I have come home to be a caregiver to my mother and father, who are both in their 80s. They're in relatively good health, but starting to face some challenges in terms of handling routine daily tasks. So I've come in not primarily as a son, but more primarily as someone who will support them as they continue on in their lives, and so that I'm able to provide basic assistance and support on a day-to-day basis. What's percolating for me this morning actually happened when my parents' phone rang at 6:30 a.m. Now, mind you, I have been here for a little over a week. I actually arrived here on July 3rd. Not sure from a calendar exactly when that was, but it hasn't been more than 2 weeks. And so I picked up the telephone. It was from the same area code that my parents live in. And this was probably, I'd say at least the 11th or 12th call that I answered. They have a landline. They do have cell phones. And strangely, they don't really get these kinds of calls through their cell phones, but they're getting them through their landline. And every single one of those calls that I've answered, I'm sorry, with the exception of one yesterday that was legitimate, was related to a scam. So if you're involved in any way in supporting older family members, parents, guardians, loved ones that have a landline, and even if they don't have a landline, there are lots of things that they're not aware of that have changed in recent years. None of what I'm saying here, by the way, is probably a surprise to most of you who watch this, but it's still important to emphasize. Every single one of those calls that I'm mentioning that I've received since I've gotten here are related to Medicare scams. And the reason that I know this is that as their screener, I will pick up the phone and basically screen the telephone call, because of the fact that I'm aware that there are companies and organizations out there that are eager to scam those who are older from their financial resources. And also, I will say, their mental health resources, their psychological resources. If you have someone who is of age of Medicare, Medicaid, or just an elderly person, and there is any information out there, by the way, I'm pretty sure that the people who have called, most of them, if not all of them, have made use of publicly available resources to find the names of individuals. They then use basically an approach to match up names to telephone numbers and start making phone calls. They will call and be very persistent about wanting permission to send information about the newest and latest of Medicare program available. I had a call from an individual who tried to convince me that the Medicare card that my parents had canceled. If you're familiar at all with the Medicare program, their cards do not cancel. Once you're on Medicare, you're pretty much on Medicare, except in probably some unusual circumstances until you pass away. But this essential caller was attempting to convince me that my parents' Medicare card and thus coverage had canceled, and I needed, very quickly to work with them to get that done. So I wanted to just kind of alert you to some of the things to be aware of. By the way, there are tons of videos on YouTube, some of them credible, some of them not as much, related to the topic that I'm talking about. So I do not attest that I am a expert when it comes to scams targeting the elderly, but I did want to provide some basic information for those of you that are not aware. The first one being that in most cases, I do know a little bit about Medicare. My parents happen to be on Medicare, and then they have a supplement. Not all people do. The first thing to understand that, even my mother doesn't necessarily understand clearly is that even though her supplement plan is branded under a national insurance provider, it's essentially a Medicare plan. The name that's used essentially for the supplement is a marketing tactic, basically. And so I have noticed a couple of times when she's talked to people, healthcare providers specifically, they've tried to kind of explain to her, this is actually just Medicare. And she's like, well, no, this is actually, United Healthcare or, any one of the other national private providers. So a Medicare supplement is a Medicare supplement, and it is a Medicare supplement. It could be that the benefits are slightly different from supplement to supplement, and also people are not required to have a supplement. The downside to that, the upside to that is the downside to that basically is that they have to pay an additional premium in order to get the supplement. The downside to it is that there's an additional cost involved. So one of the things to pay attention to is the tone of the call. Every single one of those 10, 11, 12 telemarketers that have called this home incessantly have been non-English, obviously non-English first, primary English speakers. Now, I'm not trying to be a racist here. I'm not trying to discriminate. I do know and I am aware that several private corporations hire overseas individuals to work in call centers. And there are some countries that have call centers with representatives that are easy to understand when it comes to the English language. There are others that do not. And several of those calls, it was very difficult to hear or to understand the speaker because of the heavy accent. Secondly, again, I'm not trying to discriminate, but many of these call centers hire very young individuals who aren't really dedicated to what the call center's objectives and goals are. And those I call the speed speakers. These are youngsters who are basically trying to get through a script, and they will speak as quickly as possible to get through as many phone calls as possible. And so what I've encountered essentially, and I have had considerable experience in the past working with individuals for whom English is not their primary language. These are just youngsters who are trying to survive, and so they will make calls, and once it's answered, they are speaking 1,000 miles an hour. And I can keep up with a lot of those. I was in sexual health and wellness healthcare for a while, and so I fielded lots of calls, not only from people whose primary language or first language is not English, but also individuals who are younger, who tend to speak more quickly. But that's a second signal. The third one is the persistence. I find one of the most beneficial tactics to use is to repeatedly ask the person to repeat what they've said. Done enough times, the call center representative gets frustrated and will hang up. But if they're speed callers or speed call representatives, youngsters essentially that are just trying to meet their hourly wage by the count of calls that they make, they will get frustrated right away and hang up. Those that are non-English speakers and are probably being compensated more on basically achievable or successful calls will be very diligent in trying to be more clear about the program they're providing. So the second tactic to use after asking them repeatedly to slow down is to ask them whether your parent or the person you're taking care of or yourself, if you happen to be watching this, are currently enrolled. And you will hear basically responses that try to divert the question. So if you say, am I currently subscribing to your program? Have I ever been subscribed to your program? They kind of ignore the question and hop back on to trying to make the pitch. So that's a second red flag. The reason that I ask that question also is that if they are a current provider, for example, if they are calling from the company that provides the secondary insurance coverage to Medicare for my parents, it's a call that I want my parents to answer. So I will ask them to come to the phone. The fourth tactic to use is to just confront them with a question. Is this a sales call? Are you trying to get me enrolled in a program I'm not currently enrolled in? Again, there will be a diversionary tactic of some kind. They will ask some other kind of question, or they will go back to their script because they're not trained to answer those questions. And of course, if they answer those questions clearly and truthfully, there would be no problem. The next tactic that I've noticed is none of them have gone to this level. Well, there's one that went to this level. There's a persistence based upon timing. So I remember at least 2 or 3 calls that it was like, you need to hurry because, if you don't re-enroll immediately, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. So if you're being asked to do something very quickly, or if your loved one is being asked to do something very quickly, that's a big red flag. Another red flag would be that they're asking them for their credit card number, their checking account number, any sort of financial details that give callers access to the financial information they need in order to charge and basically steal money from the person you are caring for. There is, it's just like a huge series of tactics. The other tactic that I've seen is I will basically tell them if this is a true call and you would like me to consider your services, you can always mail me your information. Now, every one of those callers will first ask the question, are you, first name, last name? And I resist answering the question initially. I basically say, what is this call regarding? Is this a sales call? I do everything that I can to kind of divert them. As I mentioned earlier, if they are valid, they won't lose their patience. They understand that they're battling these kinds of situations. However, anything that is urgent, anything that really should be, this really should apply to any situation for any person. If someone calls in and is trying to sell you something, ask them to mail that information to you. And if they say, well, okay, fine, I need to verify your address. What is your address, please? That is a signal that they are not valid. They're trying to scam you, because if anyone is calling you and wanting you to purchase something, enroll in something, verify anything, they should have this information already, or at least a previous version. So if they're able to give you an old address, for example, they might actually be genuine. If they are calling and they do have some of that information, that's helpful. The more information you can get from them, the better. I am not specifically aware of what kind of information Medicare makes available to these third-party providers who offer supplements, but I'd venture to say probably it would be first name, last known mailing address, and phone number. So forcing them to basically communicate on paper is another benefit. Now, I will tell you that there are laws. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think if you go on the website of, I believe it's the Federal Trade Commission, solicitors or individuals who are calling for sales purposes are not allowed, as of the last time that I checked, and again, it would be good if you visited the website, but are not allowed to leave voicemail messages. They are not allowed to call before, I believe, 8 a.m. in the morning, and I believe it's 5 or 6 p.m. in the evening. In this specific instance, this morning, it wasn't even 6:30 a.m., and the phone was calling, and it was a solicitor. And so I'm speaking to all of these things that can be found on a lot of resources that are available to consumers, particularly consumers that are older in age. But I don't really know if a lot of discussion is being made about the psychological and physiological effects. The phone literally rings all the time. Individuals who are, I will just say older than I am, I'm 54 years old, so I would say probably in their 60s, 70s, 80s, their go-to, because of the way they became accustomed to using the telephone, is to pick up the phone at any point in time. It's hard to get those folks to understand that probably, I would say, easily 60 to 70% of the calls that they're receiving, at minimum, are sales calls. They're calls they don't need to be answering. Most people who are younger or work in a business environment understand that it is beneficial basically to turn off your ringer. Let them leave a message. Remember, some companies do break the law, but for the most part, unless they're truly desperate or don't understand the rules and regulations, or are hidden in such a way it's easy for them to get away from it, they won't leave voicemail messages. I have repeatedly explained to my parents that they should just put their phone on silent, let it ring over to voicemail, and if there's anything that's important, they will get a notification. There are phones of different kinds, for example, that show you now that you do have voicemails. Loved ones, people that are calling for purposes regarding existing contracts or existing agreements, existing services, are allowed to leave voicemail messages, particularly if they're urgent. But it's very hard to break uh, I've noticed, at least in my situation, break my parents from the habit of answering every phone call. The second thing is they tend to work under the false assumption that used to work years ago, which is when you have caller ID, one of my parents will call back the phone number that has called them and has either been a scam or it's a dead zone line, and I'll explain why they do the dead zone line. But they'll call back assuming that phone is going to ring. That parent specifically said, you know what? I don't even know how they're doing this because I call them back at the number that they're calling me from, and it says that the call has been disconnected. How can it be that they call me and then they disconnect the phone before I call them back if it's literally minutes after? So I've tried to explain to my parent that there's a very easy way. There are very easy ways technologically that are even available to consumers now that you can essentially falsify the phone number of origin. So this particular parent has kept a list, literally, of dozens of pages in a notebook to see whether that phone number has called before, and then that she's called and found out that it's been disconnected. And the other reason that I would suggest that there be no callback is because, and I've explained to this parent this reason as well, if you call back, you're essentially signaling to that company, which is probably not legitimate, that your phone line is working. And so that just gives them a reason to call you even more often. So calling back phone numbers that come up on caller ID, not helpful at all. You're basically giving the call center information to harass you even further. The deadline scam essentially is, and I have fielded at least 7 of these. You answer the phone and no one answers. It's just a dead line. You can't hear anything. Well, the reason that you can't hear anything is that that's an attempt to verify through technology that these companies have that the line is being answered by a live person. No call center wants to have to deal with voicemail. Most of them can't leave voicemail because it breaks the law. And so they're looking for what I would call active answering lines. So again, it's very difficult for my parent to understand that technology exists out there and that people actually are doing this. Both my parents, but more so one of them, grew up sort of under the thinking or believing or understanding that at the core everyone has good intentions. That's where we begin to have problems, right? Because the truth of the matter is that these days, really, the way I function is I don't trust anyone until they give me a reason to trust them, versus trusting someone until they give me a reason not to trust them. And but it's very hard for people to kind of believe that this actually happens. So I'll probably talk about this a little bit more in a future episode. I started to research the possibility that there may be screening companies. There was one, and I can't remember the name of it, but there are screening companies where the person you're giving care to can have their telephone number forwarded to that screening company, and essentially you create what's called a whitelist in many instances in technology. A whitelist is a list of numbers of whom you expect to receive calls from, and you're able to, usually through technology, through a web interface, but I'm sure there are also some services that offer representatives that are willing to basically go in and do this. The interface is used to add phone numbers so that if someone that you know, let's just say it's an aunt or it's an uncle or it's a partner or whoever, those numbers are added to a white list, and so they ring straight through. However, any calls that are coming from unrecognizable, unidentifiable, and partially identifiable numbers, and I'm going to explain that, the whole partially identifiable, basically are screened. And so the caller, if they're calling from any sort of solicitation, the service provides a pre-recorded message written by attorneys usually that say what needs to be said to be removed from the list and to cease and desist from the phone calls, which could be very beneficial, I think, to a lot of elderly, particularly a lot of these services that I found are available for patients that have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, because all people that are dealing with Alzheimer's or any of those other sorts of diseases that basically cause trouble with memory are aware that these are services that are almost required in order for them not to end up in any sort of trouble. So I mentioned just a few seconds earlier the partial identity callers. One of the things that I've noticed started to happen, and I noticed this even before I came in to Caregive. I was paying attention to how these tactics were being used with me, and I am not of age of Medicare yet, but I am targeted by scammers like everyone else, and that is to use a phone number whose area code, origin, and maybe even the prefix, so the first three digits after the area code, are phony. They're fake. They're used because the person who is monitoring phone calls through their caller ID, if they see their primary area code and potentially the first three digits are in the same sequence or area as their phone number, they'll pick up the call. So, and it's usually it's another scam. It's another way of essentially taking advantage of folks. So I promised myself I wasn't going to make these segments more than 30 minutes long, and I'm approaching 30 minutes now. I'll have another topic hopefully for you tomorrow. It is Monday. Have a wonderful week. And if I have anything to share on the next few days, I will post something. Have a wonderful day.